Amen. So, most of you know, I'm sure, that Jossie and I raised 4 sons. And we discovered very early on, as most parents do, that every child is different.
Amen.
Amen.
Every child, although they have the same parents, they may be nothing. They may be nothing alike. And in our case, for example, 2 of our sons are musically inclined, and the other 2 just aren't interested. For the most part, 3 of our sons are pretty socially engaged and pretty outgoing, but the other one is more reserved and has a fairly low tolerance for large groups and social interaction with people. One of our sons is definitely much more emotional than the other 3. We had to notice that very early on, because all you had to do is say one little word of reprimand and he would be in tears. The other ones you had to beat on and they still didn't cry. Well, we're continuing this morning a series that I launched on the parables of Jesus. And after my introduction last week, which you can get on YouTube if you go to the site there in your bulletin, we're going to continue this morning by looking at this most famous parable, the parable of the Prodigal Son. Now, it's a story of a father and 2 sons, and 2 of the sons he had, they were very different. They were very different, and in some ways, providentially, I want to suggest to you that they represent 2 types of people in this world, but they also represent 2 types of people within each of us. Each of us contains within ourselves some of the characteristics of both of these sons, which we will see. Now, this morning we're going to focus on the younger son. It seems like in the sermons that I've read and heard preached on the prodigal, they pretty well focus on the coming home of the youngest son. But this morning, I want to spend our time focusing on the sons leaving home. Leaving home. That's the title of my sermon. Leaving home. And then next Sunday, we'll talk about coming home. And the third Sunday, we're going to talk about chaos in the home. Focusing on each character, the youngest son, the father, and the oldest son. Now, last week in my introduction to parables entitled Jesus the Master Teacher, I emphasized the fact that as the Master Teacher, Jesus often used parables. And the reason he uses parables is because stories engage the power of our imagination. When we hear a story, we put ourselves in the place of the characters, whether good or bad. In fact, it can be so powerful at times that we actually can lose our identity and we take on the identity of the character. I remember years ago, I don't know if it's still on TV or not, there was a TV series called Days of Our Lives. And I knew a friend and a woman who watched it daily. She got so engrossed in that story that if there was trouble and chaos, she would get depressed. And she would call her friend and talk about what had just happened this week with Daily in the Days of Our Lives. We can just get lost there. We get lost there. We cry with them. We feel their emotions. We laugh with them. In his book entitled The Scandal of Holiness, which I just read recently, the author argues for the value of reading even secular novels, because he points out that they can be used by God to shape our imagination in ways to either, one, inspire us to good, or to convict us or warn us of faulty behavior. Often doing a better job, he says, than reading theology. The Old Testament, for example, tells the story of Naaman, the prophet, approaching King David with regard to his sin of adultery. And what does God instruct Naaman to do? Tell a story. And that story is what convicted David. It convicted him. In most of the parables, if you notice, in most of the parables, the characters have no names. And many Bible scholars have suggested that the reason that Jesus doesn't give names to his character is because you are to put your name in there. You're to put your name in there to learn the most. And these parables teach us about life, about ourselves, about humanity. They are windows into our world. And of course, they teach us about God. The hope is, in hearing this sermon and the sermons to come, that we will all take a look at our lives and consider how we may or may not fit into the stories that Jesus tells. What I'm saying here for this morning is that there's the potential to see ourselves as this youngest son. Henry Nouwen, one of my favorite authors who wrote a book on the Prodigal Son, says this. He says, "This story beckons me to recognize the younger son in myself. At first it seemed hard," he said, "to discover in my own life's journey such a defiant rebellion, rejecting the values of my own heritage. It's not typically the part of the way that I think of myself, but when I look carefully at the many more less subtle ways, I have preferred the distant country to the home close by. The younger son quickly emerges." Of course, he says, I'm speaking here about spiritual leaving home, spiritually leaving home. And he says, more than any other story in the gospel, the parable of the prodigal son expresses the boundless love of God's compassion. And when I place myself in that story, under the light of that divine love, it becomes painfully clear that leaving home is much closer to my own spiritual experience than I might have thought. Well, you know the story, right? One day the younger son, comes to the father and he asks for his share in the estate. Apparently he had had enough of the family farm. Maybe he tired of the chores, tired of the responsibilities, the time he had to get up in the morning. Maybe he didn't like taking care of animals. So he decided to go on a trip, to leave the farm, go into the big city. But of course he didn't have any money to do that, so he had to ask for his share of the inheritance. Perhaps he was bored. He had heard stories, right, of what it was like to live in the big city. All the excitement, the fun that he could have, the people that were living there. He was tired of living out on the ranch where he hardly encountered any other people. Yes, the grass looked greener on the other side. Of course, as someone said, when you get over there, you find out it has to be mowed too. Family histories are filled with, they're filled with young adults who leave home chasing the good life. Perhaps there's talking about some of you here this morning. I mean, Some head off to college, some head off to the big city, looking for fortunes, perhaps New York, Las Vegas. Others have even left and went to Canada. Some joined the military. I know a young man who, after graduating, linked up with a friend and traveled all the way across the United States and back. Well, as you know, at first, which is often the case, things went very well for this young boy. I mean, he was living the life, living the life. He had all this money at his disposal, and you know what money does? It brings you friends. It brings you friends. He had all these friends, and you know, he was throwing parties, and he was eating, you know, top shelf food and top shelf drink, and you know, he was having a ball. But then, there's always that but then. But then, things started turning sour on him. There was a recession in the country. And the bank was no longer turning out the amount of interest. In fact, the interest went to zero. And next thing you know, he didn't have any interest to spend, and so he started spending the principal. And then the day came when, well, there was no money left in the bank. So now he had to get a job. But guess what? Because of the recession, jobs were hard to find too. He couldn't find a job. So in desperation, and by the way, his friends were all gone now. They weren't any ways around now. I mean, you can have all kinds of friends. How many know what I'm talking about? You can have all kinds of friends when things are going well in your life, but you get yourself into trouble, or you have difficulty. Maybe you even have something that's not even your fault, like cancer. Next thing you know, your friends disappear, and there's no more telephone calls. There's no more knock on the door. So, you know, it's easy to have friends when you're in prosperity, but not so much when you have difficulties in life. Well, the only job he could get was feeding pigs. And feeding pigs was the most despicable occupation that a Jew could possibly have. I looked up what would be the most despicable job today. And the one that was at the head of the list was a sewer inspector. I don't know what all sewer inspectors do, but how many know that's a stinking job? This was a stinking job, feeding these pigs. Now, it wasn't just that he had to feed the pigs, but because the man was also homeless. So the only place he had to live was with the pigs. What a picture of depravity that this story gives us here in leaving home. This is what happened. Now, what can we learn from this story then? This is what I want to leave with you. Three things. Three quick things. First of all, we need to recognize that within us and within this young man was the faulty thinking that life is much better without rules and regulations and responsibilities. Yeah. How many know teenagers, they get this in their thoughts and they think, well, you know what? I'm tired of making my bed every morning. I'm tired of doing homework. I'm tired of the chores of the house. I'm tired of curfews. I don't like them. I want to be free. So they leave home. And they strike out on their own. They strike out on their own. And this can range anything from the rules of the Christian life to the demands of taking care of a home, or perhaps the responsibility of a marriage. You know, I knew a woman that left her family, and her reason was, I need a break. I need a break. Well, we've all been there, right? We've all been there. I mean, all I'm saying is look inside of you. I mean, I hope I'm not the only one that every now and then gets this idea, you know what? Why am I doing all this stuff? It would just be good just to leave. Just leave. I like to just, you know what I'm saying? We were out in the field working one time when I was working on the farm, and it was in the fall of the year, and the geese were flying south. My uncle looked up and he said, sometimes makes a fellow wish he was going with them. Yes, it's this spirit, to some extent, of entitlement, where people, they no longer want to stay to contribute. They want to get so they can leave. Their rights over responsibilities. Nobody wants to work anymore. Everybody wants what's coming to them. What's coming to them? What, you owe me. What can I get instead of what I can give? Flies in the face of Memorial Day. As President Kennedy said, don't ask what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And today, people line up in lines to get what's coming to them, and whining and complaining about the responsibilities of life. Freedom doesn't work like that. Freedom is not cheap. And freedom is always the ultimate result of taking responsibility, not avoiding responsibility. As I've said and others have said, when you look out on a lake and you see that sailboat, seemingly haphazardly just flying along. If Bill Glass was here this morning, he would tell you that you can't sail a sailboat without rules, regulations, procedures. It's not what it appears to be, and neither is life. So that's the first lesson, and I could go much deeper in that, but we'll move on to the second. After you ask yourself what's your attitude about rules, regulations, and responsibilities, let me ask you this. Have you learned to be content with what you have? Have you learned to be content? This boy was not happy with what the father had provided and given him. Wasn't happy with it. Wasn't content. His father probably noticed it early in life. The boy was never happy with anything. He was always complaining. He always wanted more. It was never enough. He wanted what he wanted, and he wanted it now. He didn't want to wait for it. He got impatient. He had the inheritance coming to him. But no, he wanted that inheritance now. He wanted it now. He didn't want to have to wait for it. And of course, part of the discontentment that he had was with regard to material things. And I'll just mention that because it's probably one of the most prevalent in our society today. I mean, am I the only one? And I might step on some toes here, I don't know, but how many a good preacher steps on your toes every now and then? Oh, I thought I'd see more hands in that. Anyway, I mean, am I the only one that drives by all these, what do they call them, storage plots they have now? All these storage bins and storage places. And I'm wondering, who is putting all this stuff in storage? And why are they storing so much? Especially when Jesus said, don't be storing up stuff here on this earth, but store up in heaven where moth and dust doesn't corrupt. I mean, of course, they have these storage units. Get this, air conditioned, climate controlled. As if your dining room table really appreciates that. here's the dilemma. Here's what Jesus is pointing to in this young man is this lack of contentment and always wanting more than what God has provided. And isn't that what addiction is? Isn't addiction the compulsion always to have more? And it could be anything. It could be money, it could be drugs, it could be alcohol. But here's what we know. Here's what we know. When a person becomes addicted, it's never enough. I always got to have something more. I always got to have something bigger. I got to have something better. And there's this chain, right? You start out with maybe this drug, maybe you start out with alcohol, I don't know, then it goes to marijuana, then it goes to cocaine, and then it goes to this, and it goes to that. You know, you start out watching pornography, then it starts out, it goes to adultery, then it goes from adultery to child porn, and then it goes from child porn to, God forbid, it goes to child molestation, and there it goes! At the root of it, the inability, as Paul said, I've learned to be content in all things. Well, I don't know how you're doing with contentment. I don't know how you do with roles and responsibilities, but here's the last one that we need to recognize, which is the root of the whole problem. And that is that what Jesus shows us here in the life of this young man is the evidence of stupidity and insanity caused by sin. Caused by sin. Charles Spurgeon says that the prodigal son plays the part of a madman. For sin is madness of the worst kind. The insane man does not know himself to be insane. But as soon as he comes to himself, he fully recognizes the state at which he has slipped into. Here's what I'm saying. Is that when we leave home, when we leave God, we go down the path of insanity. I mean, I could imagine this young man going to his father and saying, "Dad, I'm tired here. I'm not happy. I want some money, and I want to get my inheritance. I want to leave." And the parent says to him, which many times we parents talk to our children and we say, "That's a really stupid idea." You're going to hurt yourself. This is not going to turn out good for you. I heard Jordan Peterson this past week. He was talking about atheism. Guy was making the argument that he could live better without God than he could with God. Jordan Peterson says, "Well, go ahead then. Have it your way. Let me know how it turns out for you, because I can tell you the path without God leads straight to hell." That's where this young man ended up. He ended up in hell. It was an act of insanity. One author pointed out that really what the man was saying, what the young boy was saying, is that he wished his dad was dead so he could have the inheritance. Paul writes in his epistle to the Romans that when we turn our backs on God, he turns us over to insanity, worshiping stones and wood as if they are God, and exchanging the natural passions between men and women for relationships that are illicit and crazy. And I want to tell you something. I know I'm running out of time here, but listen, be patient. Don't get in a rush. It could cost you. In my lifetime, And I'm just a young 74. Am I 74? Yeah. I'm just a young 74. But in my lifetime, I have never witnessed so many crazy things in our culture, in our society. How many know what I'm talking about? And I'm telling you right now, it's because as a country, we have abandoned and left God. We've left home. We have left our home and we've gone to the big city. And God has given us over to craziness. Irrational thinking. Faulty calculations. Stupid ideologies. Like, for example, that in the present time that Israel is committing, what is it? Genocide. When you're against the killing a different race, not infanticide. What is it called?
How about genocide?
Oh, genocide. Number one answer. Number one answer. But I know that's a political statement, so I'll move on to the next one. So, and here's the thing. Despite his insanity, despite his ignorance, the father gave in and said, okay, you go ahead. I tell you something, God won't force you to stay in his home. God won't force you to worship him. He won't force you to become his follower. If you want to live in the city in the sin, go ahead. He won't stop you. He won't stop you. We'll talk about the loving Father next week. So from the beginning, I've said this parable asks us to examine ourselves. In what ways have you and are you and do you leave home? Perhaps it's giving in to discontentment. Perhaps it's impulsive impatience, getting ahead of God's providence. Perhaps you no longer live and want to live according to God's regulations. You're making up your own rules, thinking that you're living freely when actually you're a slave. A slave. Perhaps of all the hymns, as you know, hymns are to some extent autobiographical. In fact, that they reveal something of the author's experience in life. I don't know how many of you know this hymn, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. In it says, Jesus sought me when I was stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He to rescue me from danger. He bought me with his precious blood. Oh, to grace, how great a debtor. Daily I'm constrained. Let thy goodness like a fetter bind my heart to thee. For prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart. Take and seal it. Seal it for thy courts above. That song was written by a British hymnist named Robert Robinson, who lived from 1735 to 1790. It's particularly autobiographical because it refers to Robinson's early life when his mother sent him to London to be an apprentice. During that time, he associated himself with a notorious gang of hoodlums and lived a debaucher's life until he came under the preaching of the famous George Whitefield, in which he came to his senses, gave his life to God, and became a famous preacher. He left home, but he came home. We'll talk about that next week.